Hello, this is Alex from PHP Academy, and welcome to this object-oriented tutorial on encapsulation. Now we're continuing from the previous example where we looked at classes, how to define properties and methods within a class, what properties and methods are, and how to instantiate this class and actually use the properties and the methods, or use the methods to output the property. In this tutorial we're going to look at encapsulation. Now encapsulation sounds like an extremely complicated term, and that's again with the same with properties and methods will throw you off. Properties are variables, methods are functions. Encapsulation is the basis behind visibility of your properties and methods within your class. So let's go ahead over to our class class script, which we wrote in the last part of the tutorial. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to change the visibility of some of these properties, or this only property that we have at the moment. And we're also going to change the visibility of the methods as well. Although I will mention that changing the visibility of methods doesn't always make sense, because this, for example, here is common. You would want to allow access to this set product type method. However, you may not want, from a developer's point of view, and this is only from a developer's point of view, you may not want the type variable to be changed directly. You may, for example, only want to allow the variable to be changed through the use of the set product type method. Now we use visibility modifiers, and public is a visibility modifier. Now if for example by default you omit this from your methods here, then your code will still work. If you omit this from any properties, your code will not work. Here we have a parse error, it's a syntax error, and it's an unexpected variable. And the reason for this is, well, there's no reasoning behind it, I don't think, but all I'm going to say is it's best practice to always include a visibility modifier, even if it is public. And by the way, public is a default visibility modifier, so if I don't include this on both of these methods, they'll automatically be set to public. So we're going to leave them in there now, but we'll later go in and change them just to see what kind of reaction we get back from PHP. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and just explain the three different types, the three different visibility modifiers, and then we'll see how this affects our code. So public, let's explain this first. Well, public means that it's obviously accessible within our class. So for example, we can say set the type to this value, so it's allowed to do that. For all three visibility modifiers, that is always the case. We can always access them within the current class. Whatever property you define will be accessible within that class. That's the main thing to understand first of all. Now we have public, which we can do something like this with. Echo. Let's just get rid of this so we can see them side by side. We can do echo food type, and what this will do is this will return here is we're returning this property directly, and in the second example we're returning the property by use of this method which accesses the type within the class. So the second we can look at is protected, and protected means that we can access this again within the class as we can access all properties. We can't access it like this, but we can access it if we extend this class to create a subclass. Now we're not going to, or a child class, we're not going to look at that in this tutorial because it's beyond the scope of an introduction. We are going to look at it obviously. However, protected essentially means that we can't do this we can access within the class. We can also access in any classes that originate from this class, so any child classes. So when I refresh here, you can see cannot access protected property, product, we've got the class name, and then we've got the property name as well. So we can also use private. Now private obviously allows access like this here. We can access the property within the class. We can't access the property like this, as you would naturally assume, because we've got 3 tiers: public, protected, and then private. We can't access the property like this. Let's go to our browser and refresh. You can see the only thing that's changed here is the visibility modifier. We've been noted of what the visibility modifier is. The only difference here is that if we were to extend this class, so create a subclass here, we wouldn't be able to access this within that either. Now, as I'm not demonstrating extending classes, I can't demonstrate this within this tutorial. But the main difference is to understand the visibility modifiers and what kind of level of access you have. Now, let's go ahead and get rid of that. Get product type. Now, will this with a private property return this type? Well, yes, it will. Let's refresh. It will, because we're accessing this type here within the entire product class, and then we're just returning it. So we're not directly accessing it. Now, if I was to, for example, remove, let's go ahead and just put this back to protected, because within this tutorial now, protected and private mean essentially the same thing, so we're not extending anything. If I was to, for example, let's remove get product type. No, let's remove set product type. Now I'm going to set this type to food again. Now, when I refresh, in fact, let's go ahead and get rid of this set product type and refresh. Okay, so it does the same thing. The reason being is that I have defined this here within here, and I'm using get product type to return this value. Relatively straightforward. Now, normally what we can do is we could then say food type is equal to let's say book. Now, if this was public, this would be allowed. We could overwrite this value because it's public. We can access it outside of the class. But now when we refresh, you can see cannot access protected property. If this, for example, was public, it's accessible outside, and therefore we can change that value from food to book by just accessing that property individually. So that's essentially the main difference between public and then the protected and private. If you think of the protected and private as essentially the same thing, private only has the further well, it's further hidden by not allowing any subclasses to change this value either, which again we'll look at later. So that's essentially encapsulation in object-oriented programming, PHP in this case. It's not hard at all. It's relatively straightforward. It's a relatively straightforward concept. Again, by default, functions or methods are public, but we can make these protected and private as well. Although, as I said at the start of the tutorial, we don't see much point for this because then we wouldn't be able to get the product type and all that kind of stuff. So let's go ahead and just remove everything that we've done. So at the moment we've got protected type, which is an acceptable value to give something if you're unsure. Giving it something public is not dangerous, but it means that your code can be fiddled around with in terms of as you're developing or using a class. So you may have constructed a class that you only want values to be updated and retrieved and things to be done within methods, which is fair enough. You might not want the properties accessible. For example, let's say you had a class that added up a series of numbers or incrementally added numbers. Now, if you had a total variable that you could then return, you wouldn't want this variable to be overridden somehow or modified somehow, because you're passing it a specific set of values that then add something into a total variable or a property and return this back to our code, so or from the class or the object. So we use the visibility modifier, so we can't change this value except from the methods that change and retrieve and do whatever with our properties. So that is essentially encapsulation within classes.